I am Hannah McKirker. I am a woman in my mid-40s. I'm white. I use she, her pronouns. I've got curly brown hair and I'm wearing purple glasses. And I am currently sitting in my conservatory because we have building work going on. And so I'm hiding from all of the noise so that hopefully it doesn't disturb you and us during this presentation. Sarah invited me to speak today because I am a humanist celebrant. So I have over 10 years experience taking humanist funeral ceremonies and also weddings and namings, but mostly funerals. I also do, full disclaimer, I now work for Humanists UK, which is the national charity supporting the non-religious. And I provide support to our hundreds of volunteers. And that does include the non-religious pastoral support network volunteers who are, we have some paid pastoral care practitioners within the network, but mostly they're volunteers working in healthcare settings, prisons, just starting to come within the military as well. I am not a fully accredited pastoral care practitioner, but I have done some volunteering with the spiritual care team at my local hospice, which is the Kirkwood in Huddersfield. And they provide both inpatient and at-home palliative care and lots of other support to anyone who's living with a life-limiting condition. And so that's sort of why I said I was slightly nervous about the expertise in the room. So I don't hold myself up as the expert on this. It's lovely to hear that some of you have interacted with some of the training maybe that Humanist UK have put on, and certainly Claire, the Director of Humanist Care, is an expert, and I would certainly defer to her. But also I appreciate there'll be other people in the room here today who know a lot about some of the things that I'm mentioning. It sounds as though some people do already have an idea about humanism, but I don't know whether if people can maybe give me a thumbs up if you are confident that you understand what humanism means, even before I start talking about my perspective on other things. Thank you, Louise. So Louise and I go back a long way. I'm glad to see that Louise has got her thumbs up. We've got some thumbs up on screen. Okay.
We've got
so not everyone. I mean, I'm not going to go into a whole sort of breakdown of what humanism is, but this next slide I thought was quite a useful one. Humanism in a nutshell. It's a worldview. So it's a belief that I have, a non-religious worldview. It places human beings at the center of my sort of moral outlook, but not exclusively human beings. So most humanists take into consideration all living things and the planet that we live on. It does see that world and the universe that surrounds it as a natural place. And when I try and understand things, I, as a humanist, will reach for scientific evidence and reason to try and understand things. And also it sort of values human flourishing. So the idea of sort of everyone having a chance to make the best of the life they have, and supporting other people in that. And I suppose sort of the basic principle that sort of underlines all of it. And I do go into schools, so I'm much more used to talking to 10-year-olds about humanism than all of you. But one of the slides I usually start with is to say that humanism is based on the idea that we only have one life. As a humanist, I don't have any belief in an afterlife. You know, I believe that when I die, my experiences end. And I won't go on anywhere else and have another set of experiences there. It's maybe a little bit unwieldy to invite a conversation at this point, but I would ask that you all at least have a little think about that as a concept. And I do the same with the students when I go into schools, to think about how it would make you, how it makes you feel. You might not share that belief. I appreciate that. And you might have a very different belief about what happens after we die. But if you were to consider the idea of there only being one life, this life that we are living currently, then for some people, they tell me, it makes them feel quite scared. or quite sad that there isn't a chance to be reunited with people who have died already. But I have other people who also say that it's quite a liberating idea. Certainly for myself, it's an idea that makes me think I must make the most of each and every day. And it also sort of brings the focus on this current life rather than any sort of expectation of another life to come afterwards. And for some people, it does bring a sense of peace. The idea that this is the life I have, and when it's over, that is the end, and I'm not expecting anything more. And I do think it's a really important consideration for anyone who is working with, certainly with humanists, at near the end of their life, potentially other people who describe themselves as non-religious, but obviously the concept of being non-religious covers a huge range of different worldviews and beliefs and things. So I wouldn't presume to generalize. I think one reason why I think it's really important is that it will inform how best to speak to somebody who is going through that sort of end of life pathway. And some of the euphemisms that people reach for, either when somebody is facing the end of their life or actually after somebody has died, can be incredibly unhelpful when used for someone with a humanist viewpoint. And I have worked with parents who have lost a child, who have told me of the pain caused by comments along the lines of, "Oh, well, they're in a better place now," which is not appropriate to somebody where your worldview and your belief is that that child has died, and that child is not in another place and is not waiting to see those parents again. And I think it's really important that people are careful about the language that you choose to use. So I was asked to talk about end of life care as well as funerals. And a lot of end of life care, certainly the experiences I've had, is bound up in a term called chaplaincy. In itself, that term has religious connotations, so it does come with some baggage. But a lot of people who are within the non-religious pastoral support network will still use that term, or will be prepared to carry that label within a setting because that's what other people understand by the term. But I was just going to sort of briefly talk about what humanist end-of-life care might consider or might look like. Chaplaincy overall is often sort of broken down into three areas of care. So spiritual care, so reflecting the worldview of a person, the values they hold, the sort of bigger questions. Pastoral care, that emotional support to a person, not only at the end of life, it can come at other challenging times, but obviously in this context at the end of life. And religious care, so supporting people to practice their faith or belief. And of the three, I would say obviously the third one would be the one I think most people would go, well, surely that doesn't apply if you're a humanist pastoral care practitioner. But I certainly, from personal experience, when I was volunteering at the hospice, I was not only invited to talk to people who described themselves as humanist, or even only those who describe themselves as non-religious. My role was to talk to anyone who wanted to talk. Mostly that was people who were there being cared for. Sometimes it was members of staff, family members, anyone who wanted the space and time and attention of someone to talk to. And obviously some of those people were religious. And I could still support them to practice their faith. But obviously for myself, it was more of an enabling process. So I would not lead someone in practicing their faith. I wouldn't lead a prayer. But what I might do is arrange for a faith leader to visit if that was what they needed, or simply create a space where that individual felt that they could practice their faith if they wanted to be supported in praying, what have you. But obviously for myself, I wouldn't engage in an act of worship. That wouldn't be authentic, as I don't hold any religious faith myself. So to go back to the other two, talking about spiritual care and pastoral care in turn, spirituality is certainly a term that some humanists like to grapple with and might have very different views on what it means to them. And again, I'm not here speaking for every humanist. I'm just giving you sort of my view on things. But I found that the NHS have a definition of spiritual care. That care which recognises and responds to the needs of the human spirit when faced with trauma, ill health, or sadness, and can include the need for meaning, for self-worth, to express oneself, for faith support, perhaps for rites or prayer or sacrament, or simply for a sensitive listener. Spiritual care begins with encouraging human contact in compassionate relationship and moves in whatever direction need requires. And I thought certainly you could look at that description, and there was plenty of scope there for an idea of spirituality that is non-religious. As I said, plenty of humanists have discussed what they mean by spirituality. For myself, I would probably agree that it is something about connecting with something bigger than myself. But for me, that's not an idea of sort of a higher power or an external supernatural force. It is about connecting with, you know, the universe, all of the things out there that I wouldn't claim to understand, the things that instill a sense of wonder or awe in me. I would describe those as spiritual processes. Richard Norman, you know, sort of suggested things like the experience of great art, the beauty of the natural world, but also the inspiration derived from relationships with other people. And I think those relationships are really important when it comes to spiritual care. I thought it was quite important for me to say what I do not think spiritual care is. I do, as I've said, I don't think spiritual care is only about religious beliefs and practices. What it certainly isn't, and what I was obviously really clear on when I was talking to people in the hospice, is it is not about imposing my beliefs or values on anyone else. And I think anyone offering pastoral care needs to make that commitment. And certainly not using that position to try and convert somebody to your own beliefs. Spiritual care is not a specialist activity. As I said, I don't claim to be an expert. I don't think it has to sit with people who have a qualification in it, although I do think it deserves some thought and time and care when you think about how you offer spiritual care. And it's certainly not the sole responsibility of the chaplain in a setting. Everybody there can be offering spiritual care in different ways. Say, for example, in a healthcare setting, certainly the medical staff may well also be offering a degree of spiritual care, although sometimes that is pressured by all of the other demands on what they need to get done. And so spiritual care for me would be about sort of helping people to think about where they find meaning, how they feel connected, maybe how they should live, or maybe looking back on how they have lived. And it can involve rituals, reflections, or ceremonies that provide structure and meaning to people. It can consider community, connecting around a sort of shared experience or a shared viewpoint. For example, finding other people who describe themselves as humanist. For some people, that does provide spiritual care. Belonging within a larger whole, feeling part of something else, or purpose, so discovering meaning through sort of joining together in some kind of collective engagement. So spiritual care, certainly looking at those bigger pictures, and also the pastoral care, that sort of emotional support that you can provide. I've stole this from Jan Hein Moran's work. He's an author and a member of the Dutch Humanist Association. But he sort of created this model, which I thought was quite useful from a humanist perspective of pastoral support. And pastoral support starts with a conversation between two human beings, um, and um, and is centered around the emotional and spiritual needs of one of those two human beings. And for a humanist, then we're looking at sort of the stories that people tell about themselves. So that's where that conversation often is rooted. It might be sort of reflections. It might simply be the telling, somebody wanting to tell about what has happened to them, what they've done, what they've achieved, what they're proud of, maybe what they consider to be their regrets or their failures. This, I think, is probably the most crucial bit for that pastoral care, is that you are there alongside someone. So it says walking alongside here, but I think simply being alongside someone is absolutely key. A humanist pastoral care practitioner is not there to fix things or to give the answers to those big questions that people might be asking. It's not to claim sort of expert knowledge. It is simply to focus on that person, give them that sort of full regard and value them and what they're saying and what they're sharing. And it's sort of creating a safe space and listening with empathy. So really considering how somebody else might be feeling. And hopefully what that does is sort of empower people to try and give them a sense of, maybe give back a sense of control. Certainly a lot of people have described to me in healthcare settings feeling as though all control has been taken away from them. And having a conversation that brings that focus back to the person and the person as a whole, not simply their diagnosis, but who they are, what they feel, what they think is important. Hopefully empowers them and makes them feel sort of in control again. And from a humanist perspective, allows for that sense of personal responsibility. So sometimes these conversations will be looking back at past actions. When someone's at the end of their life, they may be looking back and assessing how they acted, maybe how they wish they had acted, and anything they want to change there. Sometimes those conversations will help people to find meaning in maybe what's happened to them, what is happening to them at the moment. I wouldn't make that a promise. I think that's where they sometimes lead. But sometimes those conversations, I've had people ask me for meaning from what's happened to them, and I, as a humanist, don't feel qualified to answer that, because I don't have a belief in a sort of overarching meaning to what happens in life. I feel that each individual makes their own meaning, and so often it's a case of just reflecting that back and letting a person consider, see if they can find meaning there. But if they don't find meaning, that's okay as well, because there's no value placed on the outcome of these conversations. But sometimes it can allow that sort of self-realization about some learning that goes along. And sometimes it can allow for a reframing of someone's either situation or the way they are looking at their life and their previous actions, that hopefully moves them towards a sense of either improved well-being, perhaps feeling more comfortable with the situation they're in, sometimes towards a sense of hope. And I would say that obviously for a humanist, it's not about a hope for the future that comes after they themselves die, because we don't have a belief in an afterlife. So it's not sort of about hoping for where I'm going to end up. But it might well be hopes for the future that will continue after someone has died. It might be hopes for other people who they love or who are important to them. It might be hopes that they can see the value of things they have contributed in their life, and the idea that those things will continue even after they die. I think it's really important not to sort of pigeonhole what brings comfort to one person won't necessarily bring comfort to somebody else. And again, it is for the pastoral care practitioner, it is simply about being in that space and allowing people to come to their own conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions are really difficult, or sometimes people don't find hope. And we still need to be alongside them in that. And we can recognize how difficult that is without necessarily having a solution for it. Good practice in terms of humanist pastoral and spiritual care. There's sort of 5 main points I would say that are really crucial. Focusing on personal meaning and relationships. So as I said, humanists don't believe in some kind of overarching meaning to life, the universe, and everything. And so it is about really focusing on that individual and what is meaningful to them, whether that is their social circle or their interests or their passions, or whatever it is that brings them sort of support. And it might be about regret, sort of acknowledging regrets. Sometimes there is a practical element. Sometimes people have a regret and they want to do something about it before they die, and you can be alongside them and support them in that. Something as simple as enabling someone to write messages to people, something quite straightforward, but often it is just a reflection. Exploring the natural world can come into it, and certainly for a lot of humanists, nature is really important. And so reconnecting people, especially in, for example, in a medicalized environment, it can be more difficult if someone is receiving pastoral care in a prison environment, but certainly in a healthcare setting, you can look to try and either support time outdoors if someone is able to do that, bringing in natural elements. It might even just be pictures if actually sort of it's not feasible to bring in any part of nature. But that can bring comfort to many humanists. Obviously, the idea of empathy and compassionate listening. So very much not judging. You can hear and acknowledge what someone is saying as their own experience or view, even if you personally are thinking either that's not how I would experience that necessarily, or that's not the conclusion that I would come to. And just creating that space for people to be able to talk about whatever they wish to talk about, and hearing them as a person. So sometimes I would find when I went to speak to people in the hospice, they would say, this is the only conversation I've had today where somebody has simply talked to me as me and not given me treatment or tried to fix something, and they've just given me a chance to share. And often they weren't talking about big existential questions. They were telling me about their children, their grandchildren, their hobbies, their home that they were missing, and simply listening and valuing what people choose to share is crucial. Sometimes the conversations do involve big existential questions. And again, it's about, we can help to consider them, but it's not necessarily about providing the answers to that, because there is no sort of one answer that would suit every person, certainly not even every humanist. So you can discuss them and you can acknowledge uncertainty and difficult feelings and positions. And for some people, it might involve non-religious rituals. And obviously, again, we don't have a set of rituals as humanists that we sort of reach for necessarily. But that doesn't mean that people can't create rituals that are hugely meaningful to them. And sometimes that is something that people do themselves or with friends and family and come up with some beautiful ideas. But sometimes it is helpful to have somebody else there to suggest possibilities. I know some of you in the room, who are sort of provide this support will probably have made suggestions. Certainly people who work as celebrants, if you are talking to people before the end of their life, it might be that you are also making suggestions. And they can be, related to all sorts of things. Again, looking at sort of the natural world, maybe objects that are important to somebody, maybe creating something. So often I find that humanists do enjoy the act of creation and that sort of human endeavor, and impart their own symbolism or not. Sometimes people will simply create something because it is something that they find beautiful. And obviously some of those rituals might come in to play after someone has died. And I know the other aspect that I was asked to speak to today was about funeral practices for humanists. And I sat for a while going, oh, I need a picture of a humanist funeral. But because with a humanist ceremony, there is nothing sort of already scripted. There is nothing that has to happen at a humanist funeral. There are no words that have to be said. There are no actions that have to take place. It doesn't need to be in a particular building. So I was like, well, here are some pictures of, what a humanist funeral might potentially look like. And again, a lot of you, this isn't just for humanist funerals, a lot of you who work in the funeral industry know the choice that's out there now for families. But because with a humanist funeral, choice is integral to the whole process, because we don't have anything that sort of symbolizes something extra to ourselves. Each ceremony is purely based on that individual or the family and friends around that individual, and what it is that they want to make the ceremony into. Sometimes that does involve sort of co-creation, and as on the previous slide, some of those coffins where people have decorated themselves, the family have come together to create it, or they've chosen. I had one coffin where they had chosen this person's photos of their favorite walks and had put them all over the coffin, and that was the place that person had felt those spiritual experiences, and so for the family that was what they wanted reflected at the end of his life. And like I say, I know all of you will probably have examples of this, but people choose the symbols that mean the most to them. And, I've had coffins that have been carried in with walking boots on top, football shirts, obviously tapestries, handmade violin. I had one where it came in with a giant pork pie. That was what mattered to that person, and that was what his family wanted to reflect within the ceremony. I've had them led in by a marching band, or serenaded by a choir as we entered, or blasted by a favourite punk track, which they did manage to find a clean version of, but anything goes. People might want to be involved during the ceremony, so sort of writing notes on leaves and pinning them to the curtains, bringing buns and leaving with houseplants, and there being some kind of transition within the ceremony. Actually, more often than not, they look much like other funerals. They have a coffin that they've chosen from the brochure with a spray of flowers on the top. And as people leave, they give a nod or they go up and give the coffin a tap, and that is their acknowledgement. They can be held anywhere. So, for a humanist funeral, you can have the ceremony in your garden if you wish. You can have it at the pub. You can choose whether or not the coffin is part of that ceremony. Some people have a direct cremation and then bring the ashes to the ceremony. Some people don't have the physical remains of the person there at all. They can arrive by lorry or transit van on the back of a tractor. I've had ones where 12 people have stood around the coffin and we've said the words of committal together, and others where 250 people have sung Waterloo Sunset at the tops of their voices. One where there was only a husband saying goodbye to his wife with his daughter beside him for comfort. whatever a humanist funeral is, it is centered on the person, and that makes it sort of simple to approach, but obviously quite difficult to define. But it's all about sort of who that person was and what people choose to say about them. And obviously, if known, they might involve the personal wishes of that person who's died. And sometimes those might come from the person themselves. So I have a sort of relatively small, compared to the number of funerals overall, but a small proportion where somebody has chosen to speak to me before they themselves die. Most of the time when they are sort of facing a terminal diagnosis, so they are sort of acutely conscious that this is something they want to address. But occasionally where somebody is simply planning ahead, they want to make sure that something is done the way they want it to be done. And I find that those sort of pre-need visits cover a huge range of reasons why somebody's asked for them. So some people have simply wanted to meet the person who is then going to stand up and speak about them at the funeral. And once they've met me and had a chat and decided that I've not got two heads, then that's enough. That's all they wanted to do. Some people do want to tell something of their own story in their own way, to sort of make sure that the things that are important to them will be reflected when it comes to the funeral. Some of them want to leave messages, so they want to speak to a third party, as it were, and leave something very specific behind, so that when after they've died, there is something that will then be shared with family or friends who are left behind. Obviously, most humanist ceremonies, certainly that I do, most of the funerals I do, I am talking not to the person who has then died. I'm talking to their family and friends. And so it just brings us back round to the empathetic and compassionate listening that is so important within the end of life care, is just as important when you're sort of creating a funeral, about sort of really listening to what people are saying. Obviously, again, with the basis that humanists believe we only have one life, the funeral is not talking to the person or referencing that person going somewhere else or being somewhere else. But it is about celebrating who they were, actually, for those who are left behind, who are still there, who are missing them. And 99 times out of 100, they are a celebration. They are usually honest. So I would say I very rarely get families and friendship groups who will pretend that somebody was entirely good. And there's no disrespect in that, no disrespect in being real about who someone was, and in acknowledging their faults, often having a good laugh about them in the process, but also being glad of their better qualities and valuing and sharing those. And on a very few occasions, they can be a frank reflection on a life that has caused harm, and actually that those present are not necessarily celebrating, but there is still that acknowledgement of the importance of marking a life and wanting something to acknowledge it. I thought I would just very briefly mention the Humanist Funeral Tribute Archive, and I did have a link open, but I think I've lost it. But I will drop the link in the chat once I stop sharing. So anyone who has had a humanist funeral, any family has the option of putting the tribute for that person onto the Humanist Funeral Tribute Archive, which was set up mainly because, as I said before, humanists value the stories about individual people. And there was a sort of recognition that often the only lives that are recorded are the sort of the great lives that get put down in history books. And so I have been privileged enough to be told the stories of over 1,150 lives now, so far. and often when I turn up for a meeting with a family, they will start off going, I don't know what we're going to talk about. They didn't really do that much, or, they never moved more than 2 miles down the road. And then obviously we sit and talk for 2 hours straight, and I make reams and reams of notes. And the family and friends who are there tell me all of these small things that that person did that really aren't small at all, and I would consider great. The love that they shared, the kindnesses they offered, the wisdom they imparted, or even simply the laughs they created, but certainly the memories they have left behind. And for me, each of those lives is valuable, and deserves the option of being recorded. And for some families, this tribute archive is a really useful part of their grieving. They appreciate the chance to save that tribute and have it visible. Some of them are sort of, sometimes the person who's died was a history enthusiast, and so the idea of them contributing to the social history of humanity is a really positive thing for the families. And obviously there are some families who go, it's not for me, and that's absolutely fine. I will say that the archive, the families always retain rights to the tribute and can ask to have it removed at any point. So it still remains a personal sharing that is just an option for them. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and also for those of you, I know we've got people here from various settings, from end of life care, from healthcare, from the funeral industry. I really appreciate how many conversations there seem to be going on these days about considering all beliefs and worldviews in the approach you take, and I do think that's really valuable and can only be sort of better for all of us. And particularly thank you to Full Circle for hosting these webinars, which I think are a really useful way of sharing those ideas.